Squeezing the finest minds to extract the purest science? Welcome to Juicy Interview.
Hi, Professor. I'm Emmanuel Adukwu. Very huge thank you for joining us today for this Juicy interview. I'm Juisci. I'm a senior medical content manager at Juisci, and so I will be interviewing you today. So first, let me just give an introduction. So Professor Emmanuel Adukwu, you are a microbiologist at the University of the West of England in Bristol, where you have spent over 2 decades exploring how natural compounds spanning from lemongrass to cinnamon can take some of the world's most dangerous drug-resistant bacteria. You were also recently named the UK's top bioscience teacher in 2023 and also elected as a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology. And finally, you are also one of the most prominent voices for diversity in the life sciences and the founder of the UWE Bristol Black Professorate and chair of the Minoritized Life Scientists Future Forum, one of the first of its kind in Europe. So first, Professor, have I missed anything in this introduction?
So I've been here less than 2 decades. That's the only thing.
Okay.
Yes,
Perfect. Noted.
that's fine. Yeah.
All right, so let's start first from the beginning. So when you were studying biomedical sciences, what drove you to microbiology and specifically to essentially oils, which is, in my opinion, not the most obvious direction for a microbiologist to take?
Very interesting question. Actually, initially, I started my education in Nigeria as a medical student, and then some way through it, I had to leave Nigeria, and then I studied in the UK. And in that time, I enjoyed different programs. So different courses. I enjoyed physiology, for example. I enjoyed medical genetics. But for my final project, I ended up with microbiology. When I was investigating which topics to choose, what I chose to do was on honey, because I just saw that honey had antimicrobial activity, and I was like, honey, we all use honey, so that looks really interesting. I started with that, and then because of the experience I got doing that work and what I found with the positive action of honey against certain bacteria, I then found a master's by research project which was looking at essential oils. And when I started investigating, I was thinking it's along the same lines. So I thought actually it would be worth investigating at that time. And that has suddenly then become a long-standing approach that I've taken in terms of some of the work that I've done.
Oh, wow. It all starts from honey then.
It started from honey.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, what's pretty interesting with your work is that it spans multiple fields, like
Yep.
from natural antimicrobial compounds, clinical diagnostics, epidemiology, and science education, which is quite a broad portfolio. So in the end, is there a central scientific question that connects all of those threads to you?
So for me, the key question is, how do we reduce the burden of infection? And we can reduce the burden of infection through thinking about antimicrobial resistance in this broader sense. Then thinking about actually how do we develop, considering we have a lack of new antibiotics, we're not developing antibiotics fast enough to be able to address the pathogens. Can we think about alternatives? So that's one part of the conversation. Then in terms of clinical diagnostics, it's really important that we know we are able to identify very quickly what pathogens are there. So some of the work which we've done with the swab transport systems and development of swabs and development of the media to actually be able to help with improved diagnostics of certain pathogens. That also connects to that conversation, because when you think about different terrains around the world and hard to reach areas, sometimes the problem that you find is the timeliness of information and reporting from when that infection is found to when people are actually able to interpret what exactly is there. And then in terms of education, we who are scientists can do what we do in our spaces, but we want people who are actually within the communities who are much more likely to come across these pathogens, these infections, to be aware of what they are, but also be able to do certain things that can improve their own knowledge, but also how to navigate or prevent certain infections. So it's how do we broadly, in a very broad sense, reduce that burden of infection?
All right, that's very interesting. And actually, like you were saying, most of these topics were addressed through all the body of evidence that you have built on the antimicrobial and antibiofilm properties of natural compounds. So not only honey, but also lemongrass, thyme, cinnamon, against some of the most resistant pathogens we face. So for example, you have worked on Staphylococcus aureus and I'm not sure I will pronounce it correctly, but
Pseudomonas
Pseudomonas.
aeruginosa. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet what is interesting is that still today, the clinical uptake remains quite limited. So in your view, what is actually holding that back? And is it more a question of regulatory frameworks, or is it the scientific community itself that is not yet convinced?
It's a combination of things. There's a regulatory conversation, which is holding some of this work back. There's also the scientific community, which is also feeling that there's a need for more evidence to be provided around the use of this. So there's a thing about acceptability. I know we've seen that with many other alternative compounds, things like bacteriophages, for example, or things like using maggots in wound healing, or things like using poop in people where people have a seed of infections, for example. These things do take time to be accepted because they're not seen as the conventional. You need to do quite a lot more work to convince people that these could be the right ways to go. There are groups that are starting to look at how we make this more mainstream conversation and how to make this more of a conversation that we should be having more broadly. What is really interesting is in undergraduate education, we're seeing more and more projects that are being developed with the use of essential oils. And I remember about 16, 17 years ago, going to a very big microbiology conference. And I think I was one of 3 people who were presenting on stuff to do with essential oils. And now it's very hard for you to go to any conference now where there's microbiology, where you wouldn't find this conversation. So it's starting to get accepted. We're seeing more publications come through in this area, but there's still some time to go. But one of the major challenges is also funding. So while we have the regulatory conversation or the acceptability, that also impacts who gets to be funded to do this type of work. So that's where one of the major challenges tends to be.
I see. And do you see some evolution regarding funding that goes with the trend of having more?
It's not moving at the pace which it needs to. You'll see more of that with sort of partnership type funding, industry related type funding, where companies are also engaging with universities to do this type of work. You're much more likely to see engagement in that space than maybe with research council funding. So there is still some way that we need to go with this work.
I see. And actually, talking about company-based funding, you have recently collaborated with the Pukka brand that produces herbal teas that I'm a huge fan of.
Yep.
So, specifically to investigate the impact of herbal tea consumption on microbial flora and metabolism. So, actually, what did those findings reveal, and were the effects consistent across different types of herbal teas, or did some specific compounds stand out?
So
in
there's
this
only
research?
so much I can speak about because there's some unpublished data which we're currently working
Okay.
on at the moment. So I wouldn't give out too much on that side. But in terms of the work, some of it is still kind of early stage. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was put some evidence. I think the big challenge is also the evidence. So in terms of the broader picture of herbal teas, there's a lot of information about black teas, green teas, but actually the broader herbal tea space, there's still a lack of evidence within that space in terms of effectiveness of these. So part of what we're trying to do is build a profile around how effective are these and which teas or which blends of teas might be potentially useful for certain types of things. So we were looking at metabolic activity, improving metabolic function using these herbal teas, and these are some of the things that we potentially will be sharing with the wider public very, very soon. And also some antimicrobial
Nice.
activity work with the teas.
Okay, very interesting. And so more broadly, do you think that not only for antimicrobial resistance, but in general, do you think that plant-based interventions are going to be, we are kind of in this turning point to have more and more plant-based interventions for health, or is it still a bit...
Would I say we're at a turning point? I wouldn't say we've reached that turning point yet. But I think there's a growing interest in nature-based solutions. And for the last decade, there has been this growing interest. But I think part of where the challenge is just having, without funding, it's difficult to get the evidence that you need. And without funding, it's difficult to get into clinical trials. So you need the clinical trials to be done to be able to, you need the funding for the projects to be done, in vitro studies and in vivo studies. Then you get to clinical trials to be able to then say, based on this evidence, these are the types of things that the finders are telling us. So that I think we are not there just because it's not been funded well enough to this point. But I think with the kinds of projects that we've done and other groups are doing across the country and also around the world, there is going to be at least a point where we can say, this is what the evidence is telling us. In our scoping review, we could see the very large range of effects and positive benefits that these herbal teas have and plant compounds can have. It's now just a case of translating that into things like clinical trials and getting industry involved in terms of, okay, what do we now need to add to some of these compounds and making sure that people can start to accept, but also a marketability conversation. We also need to market these so that people can start to see, well, these things are being shown to be beneficial. Then what do we do with them? So there's still some way to go.
Yeah, and that they are backed up by science and not just
Absolutely.
like infos. Okay. So now to turn a bit more onto the more global picture, you have published systematic reviews that have mapped significant gaps in antimicrobial resistance surveillance, especially across African healthcare systems. So in your opinion, what would the closing those gaps generally require today?
The good thing I think I can say is the global effort to address antimicrobial resistance is really positive. Using the sort of One Health approach to addressing antimicrobial resistance has helped. In some of the work that we've done, what we can see there are in a major way, I think some of the things that we're dealing with infrastructural issues, but also policies as well. So there are policy-related issues, there are regulatory issues, there are also infrastructural issues, which in a way are some of the major challenges that many African countries and healthcare systems have. So that really impacts the type of reporting that you will find, the type of data collection systems that you're going to find. It also impacts, actually, it depends on the type of healthcare systems that you have in those countries. That also impacts the quality of the data. That is also translated into what then becomes wider reporting. So in some cases, you have the lack of data because the readiness of that system to collect that data is not there. In some cases where the data is being collected, the quality of the data that's been collected is not such that you can make very strong policy decisions around what to do around this. But I think there is that growing collaboration. One key area of a major challenge, and I think so I'm sure we can talk about, is diagnostic capabilities and timely reporting of this of diseases and infections. So in some countries, things are better than they were maybe a decade ago because they have national action plans that are being followed. But in some countries, even where they have national action plans, the infrastructure still seems to be the barrier in terms of trying to get from plans and policies to implementation.
I see. So do you think that the state of AMR surveillance in Africa is maybe a unique African challenge, or is it a reflection of this broader
It's a
problem,
reflection of the
global
broader
problem?
picture. So in terms of AMR surveillance in across the world, you would have disparities. Some countries would be with more improved healthcare systems and more improved reporting systems and data infrastructure will be able to do better surveillance of AMR. And in countries where you have poor infrastructure, technology gaps and things like that, your AMR infrastructure would not be as developed. And these are where the challenges are. So if you go across Africa, you'll find a disparity across different spaces. And the same if you go to Asia and if you go to other parts of Europe as well. So it's not as coherent everywhere as it needs to be. But some of these challenges are unique, and they're unique to individual countries and individual healthcare systems. So it's, in the broad picture, things are getting better. But actually, when you go to the granular level, you find that there are disparities of how these systems actually are able to implement AMR surveillance.
Yeah, so we have to find ways to address also those peculiarities, basically.
Absolutely, yeah.
I see. Also, another aspect of your career is, alongside your research, you're also a very strong advocate for the inclusion of minorities in science, which is a very important topic.
Yeah.
So, as I was saying earlier, you have built the Minoritized Life Sciences Future Forum that was founded with the UWE's Black Professorate and have published on equity for Black microbiologists specifically. So at what point did you decide that this was part of your scientific responsibility and not something separate from it?
I think these are separate things. So the Minoritized Life Sciences Future Forum is a platform that is trying to drive inclusion in the life sciences sector. And the focus actually that we have is just the whole European space. The reason being, we do have a lack of diversity, firstly, across our life sciences space. If you look at the university systems, if you look at the college systems, if you then look at actually industry, there's a lack of diversity within those spaces. And we know based on data that wherever you have diversity, you have productivity. If you look at it from industry data, data tells us where you have more women in your boardrooms, you're going to have better financial outcomes. When you have gender diversity, when you have ethnic diversity, you are going to make more money if you're a business. So knowing that, then the question then is, what have we been doing in terms of trying to advance diversity and inclusion within our spaces? And I think the pace of that has been really slow. So for a very long time, that pace has been very slow. So for me, having experienced a conference in the US, which is called Abracams, which is actually trying to do something similar, and this year will be the 25th year of that conference, having experienced that, I felt that in Europe, we needed something quite similar and bringing people together across the entire pipeline. Because part of what we need to do is, if we want to increase the diversity of our boardrooms, diversity of our research community, then we needed to build the pipeline to be able to enable that to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's why we have the Minoritized Life Sciences Future Forum. Now, in terms of the UWI's Black Professoriate Group, that's an internal university group, which I started a couple of years ago. And the focus of that group was really, we have a significant gap in the UK education space in terms of Black professors. We have somewhere near about 25,000 professors in the UK across the sector, but of that you have quite a low number, less than 1%. So currently the Black professors we have in the UK are 0.8% of that 25,000. That's the representation. And when you look at the data from when you look at our census data in our communities, many parts of the UK, representation of people from global majority groups runs to about 20%. For example, Bristol, where I am, about 22%. That's not reflected in the higher education system. So what you then find is when people come into university to do their undergraduate degree, then from undergraduate to master's and PhD, we just see almost like a halving of that number, and that continues to halve until we get to professorship. Whereas if you look at other demographics, the number doesn't halve, it actually goes up. So there's an increase to professors from undergraduate if you look at our white academics. There's a decrease, almost like an opposite if you look at our Black academics. And we see the same for Asian and other academics. So what we're trying to do is say, we say there's a problem. The sector says there's a problem. For example, in terms of Black women, we only have about 100 Black women professors in all disciplines across all universities in the UK. Now, it shows the scale of work that needs to be done. So part of what we're trying to do is say, okay, how do we develop the next professors at my university, but also how can we make sure that we have a model that other universities can also utilize in their own institutions to increase the diversity, but not just by saying we need to increase diversity, but actually preparing people for what life as a professor is going to be like, but also what is expected of them as professors. And that's why we have those two groups.
And do you think, it may be a naive question, but are those issues only systemic or also individual?
These are largely systemic issues.
Okay.
So there are systemic barriers that prevent people from becoming professors or getting into senior positions. And it starts from when they're undergraduate students. So there's something we're dealing with now in the sector called awarding gaps, but also who gets to access education, who gets to finish university is also a problem. And then who gets to progress from undergraduate to postgraduate degrees, who gets to be funded for PhDs. So there are significant disparities across all levels. So part of what we're trying to do is shine a torch on the problems, but also offer a solution for how you can also address the problem. So we can all say what the problems are, but what are the solutions and how we can address it is what we're trying to do.
Okay, it's very interesting and very important work also.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But so in the end, do you think that still the scientific community, though it is slow, is it moving towards the right direction? Or in the end, not so much? What do you think about that?
So my
It's
personal
a tough
opinion,
question.
it's a tough question. And my personal opinion on this is, um, we are having the conversations now. Even though it's taken very long for us to get here, we are talking about them now. So there is progress because we can talk about these issues. The pace of which where we need to get to is going to take us time to get there. But I think there are conscious efforts across different parts of the sector to say, okay, what can we do to address these disparities? Unfortunately, at different points, it also depends on the politics of the day. So sometimes the politics of the day seems to be hitting back as a barrier to progress. But I think there is a lot of wider interest and also resilience that is being developed for people who are in this work to recognize that the politics of the day also has its time. So that will still come and go, but we need to keep a momentum for how we are able to say, okay, getting people to really understand the importance that when we talk about diversity, the progress around diversity, it's not just about getting people who are not deserving to be there, but it's about saying, imagine what you can have when you have a difference of opinion, a different perspectives and different skill sets in the room, and how that improves your sector. And that's the direction that we're hoping that we will continue to push and we'll see change in our sector.
Hopefully, in a bit of a faster pace than what it is at the moment.
But it still boils down to one thing: we need funding, we need resources, we need finance.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And as we can see, your interest spans multiple topics, and maintaining all this scientific rigor in this wide range of fields requires quite a constant engagement with a very broad literature, right?
Yeah.
So today, to kind of getting back to the topic of Juisci, how do you manage that in practice? Has your approach to the scientific literature evolved over the course of your career?
Oh, yes. I think as you develop in your scientific career, there will be that evolution. Starting out your career when you are, if maybe finishing your PhD, you're doing your PhD and doing research, you're working as a researcher, your approach is different. When you become a research leader, your approach is also different. And there are demands on that time in different ways. So part of it for me is about how do I mentor and develop researchers to come through. So I'm able to channel a lot of my ideas through the research, through funded research and through my research group, and people are able to, we can then bounce all those research ideas through. But that means I still have to keep abreast of whatever is going on in the science, which I still try to do, but also working through my research group, through the academics in the group and through the researchers in the space. They're also able to help me with actually knowing what's going on within the research space. So having that kind of balance has been really helpful. Going to conferences, I'm still able to go to conferences and contribute to research, but also hear other people's research. So these are things that that's how I tend to manage that practice. And I can't say it's easy. It's not easy, but I still enjoy it. So I still try to do as much as I can.
That's very important. All right. And before we close, if there is one message you would want clinicians and healthcare professionals or academics to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
We need to keep on working together. We need multi-sector collaborations. And when I speak to colleagues, sometimes I say, we need to stop just speaking to ourselves alone. As scientists, we can't just speak to scientists alone. We can't just speak to scientists and medics. We need to be speaking to people in the community. We need to speak to the public. We need to speak to businesses. So we need to also think about maybe how we re-evaluate our funding systems and funding models. So for me, the key question is, everybody is like to suffer from an infection at some point in their lives. In fact, all of us are likely to suffer from an infection at some point in our lives, which means AMR can affect any one of us at any time. So we need everybody around the table, not just those who are the experts or the scientists or the medics or the clinical professionals. We need to speak to community groups. We need to speak to different age groups. And we need to make sure that those who are business owners and people outside our own spaces are part of our conversation to reduce AMR. That way you're going to reduce reliance on antibiotics, overuse of antibiotics, misuse of antibiotics, use of antibiotics in poultry, in businesses, in those external areas that we are not always going to think about. That's the kind of way that we need to go with this.
All right. Collaboration then. And finally, just one last very important question. Are you more of a green tea with honey type of person or a juice of science person?
A combination. So I'll say juice of science is me.
All right. Maybe with a slight touch of
With a
honey
slight
then.
a bit of honey in it.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you again for joining us for this interview today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.